Oh.
Thank you. We got it? Hello. Whoa, it's quite a noise there. Hello and welcome to this evening's science shows or Forskning, viser. Today I'm very proud to present this evening's speaker, Simon Kuper, who's going to tell us why Norway is, as a football nation, the best country in the world per capita. He is a international acclaimed author with the book Soccernomics and Football Against the Enemy. He's a writer for the Financial Times, and will go on for 30-45 minutes and then open for questions. I will also just remind you all that, well, this is a cooperation between the Bergen Public Library and the University Library. So we at the library have picked a small selection of somewhat relevant books, I hope. So feel free to peruse later. And I'll give the floor to Simon.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. Hi. So, just one question, sorry. How do I click? Because I have slides. Charlotte. Down.
Take it down.
Down. Okay, I'll do that. Thanks very much. Well, thanks very much for coming, everyone. And I'm going to do something very risky, which is that even though I know less about Norwegian sport than probably anyone in the room, I'm going to talk to you about Norwegian sport. So please bear with me. And to do this, to talk about why you have, I think, the best athletes in the world per capita, and why more than any other Europeans you seem to have a special relationship with football, I'm going to draw on my book Soccernomics, which I've been writing actually again and again for years, because it first came out in 2009, and we've done new editions every year, which we've had to update, take out bad forecasts, put in new forecasts, and so on. And this is last year's Soccernomics. I just want to talk about the origins of Soccernomics, because it began in the Hilton Hotel in Istanbul, and it's quite an ugly, grey, concrete building. But it's a haven of peace in Istanbul, because outside you have this 16 million person city, dirty, noisy, full of traffic jams. You drive into the Hilton, the security guards check your car for bombs, they let you through, and inside all is tranquil, and the only stress is about what to do next. Should you play some tennis? Should you continue to overeat? Have a Turkish bath? So you feel, you come to a kind of inner peace, and I think that is why the book began there. And it's also because while there I met another Brit called Stefan Szymanski. He's called Szymanski because his father was a Pole who came to England in 1940 to fight the Nazis, but Stefan was born in Britain. And we'd been both flown to the Hilton by Fenerbahce Football Club because they were having their centenary congress on sport and science. So we were both guests there, and we met there, and we went out for some beers, and we began to talk about football and realized that we thought very similarly about it. Now, we have different jobs because Stefan's a sports economist, so he is trained to crunch numbers. He calls it torturing the data until they confess. And I'm a journalist, so I go out and interview people. But those are really just surface differences, because we both believe that data can explain and even predict a lot of things in sport. And in football, as you probably know, this was quite an unusual approach, because football had always escaped the Enlightenment. It ignored data. It was done entirely, all decisions in football were made until quite recently on gut feeling. Football clubs were run by men who did what they did because it had always been done that way, so that must be right. And so these men did things like they would, in the past, they discriminated against black footballers because they thought they weren't clever enough to play football. And today they discriminate against black managers. So instead they hire white managers, they buy the wrong players, and then let those players take free kicks and corners in the wrong way, because that's how it's always been done. And my favorite example is the direct free kick, where the best player in the team will put down the ball and the crowd will go silent, and he walks back a few yards and he pauses and he runs up and he kicks the ball 20 yards over the crossbar. And this is a ritual in football. And it's a crazy thing that the player is allowed to do that, because a direct free kick is a great opportunity to pass into the penalty area, because the other team has to put a wall in case the guy does shoot. And so you have a majority of players, the attacking team, to put in the penalty area, the only time that ever happens. But they never do that. The ritual is the best player always is allowed to shoot the direct free kick over the crossbar. And we're deluded by images of the ball going into the top corner, because those are the ones we remember. That's the availability heuristic. We remember things that are available to the memory. And of course, there's the odd exceptional player. So if you have Cristiano Ronaldo, it's probably a good idea for him to take direct free kicks. But if you're not Cristiano Ronaldo, you shouldn't. But anyway, football makes these mistakes. Even the people who buy football clubs, who always come in promising to run it like a business, to be rational in their decisions, they always depart after a few years amid the same derision as their predecessors. We have in the latest Soccernomics an interview with Tony Fernandez, chairman of Queen's Park Rangers, and he says to us very honestly, "I screwed up." And that's the story of most people who run football clubs. But fans and journalists aren't blameless either. I mean, we keep circulating the same old cliches like football is big business, football has become boring because the big clubs always win, or big money will turn clubs away from football, to name just three. And in the book, we examine these cliches and we find that they are wrong. But I want to talk, as I say, specifically about Norway. And I wanted to tell you about the 2 chapters in the book in which Norway has a starring role. And the first chapter is one where we set out to find the best country in the history of sport. And you'll all know the cliche that says that poor people are kind of best equipped to become athletes because they have a hunger, they want it more. Football or sport is their way out of the gutter, so they have the special motivation that rich people don't have. And when those poor people are black, there's also this idea that they're somehow genetically more suited to excel at sport than white people. And the evidence that poor people are good at football in particular seems to be before our eyes. I mean, if you think of the French national team or the Dutch national team, for years they've been dominated by players from poor immigrant backgrounds. The German team is going the same kind of way. Brazil and Argentina, their internationals are not typically the sons of corporate lawyers either. And it's the same in American sports. Basketball, American football draw most of their stars from American ghettos. And if you think of the great footballers, you know, a lot of them started life very poor. I mean, Lionel Messi's family didn't have enough money to fund his growth hormone treatments, without which he'd have probably been only about 1.60 meters tall. Diego Maradona almost drowned as a child, falling into the cesspit, the outdoor public toilet of his slum. Samuel Eto'o spent his whole career really essentially funding hundreds of people in Cameroon. And in Europe, you know, most of our best footballers have grown up in the poorest bits of Europe. Cristiano Ronaldo in Madeira, Wayne Rooney in Liverpool, and Zinedine Zidane and Zlatan Ibrahimovic in very poor ethnic ghettos. So there's a lot of prima facie evidence that poor people are somehow better at sport. But in fact, you've guessed it by now, this is the way Soccernomics works, this cliche is false. And we did an investigation, and it showed that the world's poor people and poor countries are worse at sport than rich countries. And we did a very simple exercise, which I'll walk you through, to find out which countries are best at sport. And this simple exercise is we combine the historical results of the big international sports tournaments, the Summer and Winter Olympics, the World Cups in various sports, like from rugby to football, individual tournaments in tennis and golf, the Tour de France and so on. And we combine all these data. For some sports, the data go back more than a century, and for some only a couple of decades. And in all sports, we ended in 2013. And in most sports we looked at, we ranked the top 5 countries in that sport, usually based on how many world titles they'd won. So the number 1 country would get 5 points, number 2, 4, down to the number 5 got 1 point. Very simple. And of course you could argue with this methodology, there are different ways of doing it, but I think this gives a reasonably good picture of the whole global sporting picture. And I'll just give you a couple of examples of our rankings, the ones where Norway does well. And I'll start with women's football, based on number of World Cups won and appearances in in World Cup finals and so on. And up to, not including this summer's Women's World Cup, we came up with this ranking. So pretty impressive for Norway. The Summer Olympics, obviously we had to give an extra weighting to, because all the sports are in there and all the countries of the world compete. So we rewarded the top 10 and not just the top 5 countries in the medals table. And we gave the best country in the history of the Summer Olympics 50 points. And we gave points to the top 10 countries. And so for the Summer Olympics, this is our ranking. Norway again, you know, still, 10th place. Not bad. Winter Olympics, we gave 3 times the rankings of individual sports. We didn't want to count too many countries because not many countries compete in the Winter Olympics in the first place. If you live in Britain, it doesn't even happen. And so we only rewarded the top 5 in the medals table, which obviously includes Norway. So we did this for lots of individual sports, from, as I say, from rugby to cycling. And at the end, we came up with a ranking of the best countries in the history of sport. And somewhat what you'd expect. I personally was surprised at how well Germany did. Sorry, that should be including East Germany. No, including West Germany only, that's correct. We left out East Germany's medals, which would have put Germany even higher, because East Germany's medals were even more drug-based than everybody else's medals. And the ranking is impressive, but it's obviously not fair, because inevitably a big country like the US is going to get more points than a small country like Norway or San Marino. So, more interesting question, we thought, is which country is the all-time sporting world champion per capita? And to calculate that, we worked out how many points each country scored per million inhabitants. And this is where it gets very relevant for Norway, because these, according to our estimates, are the world's best sporting nations per capita. You're number 1. And in fact, your lead is so big that you'd have been number 1 even if we hadn't counted the Winter Olympics. So it's really an astonishing performance. You won more points in the competition than all of Africa and Asia, if you leave out Australia, New Zealand, if you leave out Oceania, put together. So Norway best, and then all of Africa and Asia. And it's just, really, there's no other country that begins to compare. But what these rankings, the rankings of the best nations per capita, what that really shows is the importance of wealth. Because this efficiency table for sports is strangely like another global ranking, the United Nations Human Development Index. Because the UNHDI, which is the most famous ranking in development economics, measures life expectancy, literacy, education, and living standards to rank every country in the world by well-being. And we found that sporting success per capita is very highly correlated with development success. Because this is the UNHDI. I'm sure you knew, and I'm sure you're unsurprised, Norway number 1 again. And it's not just Norway, though, because Australia, New Zealand, and Germany are also in the top 7 of both rankings, world's best sporting countries and best UNHDI. And the US was the world's best sporting country per se, and also in the top 5 for human development. So in other words, highly developed countries are very good at sport. And why is that? Well, you really know better than me, because if you look at the case of Norway, it's government policy that every farmer, every fisherman in Norway, every male or female should have the right to play sport. And the country spends what is required to make that possible. So just as in Britain we build supermarkets on every empty space, in Norway you have all-weather sporting fields all over the country. And it's very hard to gauge how much sport people actually play, because if you ask them, they lie, but it does seem that Norwegians and most Scandinavians play more sport than normal people. And I once spoke to Knut Helland, a professor here at Bergen University, who wrote a book on Norwegian sports and media about this. And he points out that Norway has the biggest ski race in the world, with more than 13,000 participants. And, probably wanting to play sports is a universal human drive. Everyone would want to play sports. But if you live in Beijing or Shanghai, you probably can't. There aren't football fields where you can go to. In London, if you want to play outdoor football or cricket, it's almost impossible now. You can play five-a-side football if you spend some money, but it's very hard in most countries to make it possible for everyone to play sport, and Norway does that. And Norway gives people also the food and medical treatment they need to become good at sport. I mean, height is a good proxy for health, and Norway is one of the 3 tallest countries in the world, I think. So, in other words, human development of every person in the country will, in the end, buy you sporting trophies. Now, after the first edition of Soccernomics came out, Christopher Anderson, who's a political scientist at Princeton, later wrote a very good book called The Numbers Game. He wrote a response, and he said, look, you're placing too much weight on wealth to explain sporting success. And he analyzed all football World Cups from 1950 to through 2006. Now, it's a slightly different study. We looked at all sports. He's looking at football World Cups. But anyway, he says the key to winning isn't really wealth, it's democracy. Democracies win World Cups. Now, he's probably right, because wealth and democracy are very closely correlated. If you leave aside a few Gulf states, almost all the rich countries in the world are democracies. And so it becomes tricky to say what is the effect of wealth and what's the effect of democracy. Maybe democracy is more important to winning football matches, but maybe even more important is the average quality of schooling in the country. Because, of course, schooling is a good proxy for how well a country channels resources to its people. So if you're good at providing schools for everyone, and most democracies are, you're probably also good at providing sports fields for them and coaches. So is Norway good at sport because it's democratic or rich or well-educated? It's probably all 3, and those things can't be separated. But however you measure it, poor countries are poor at sport. And it's no coincidence that China was rubbish at sports until it got some development, and then the Beijing Olympics went to the top of the medals table. China also does this thing where it targets sports where you only need to have a very few people playing. So there's sports like basketball or rowing where you can select champions almost at age 2 just by their physique, and China does that. It doesn't invest in sports like football where you need to have millions of people playing and then in the end find out which ones are good. It's even worse in African countries, most of which barely even bother to compete in most sports except football and some running events, and of course those are the cheapest sports to get good at. So why are poor countries bad at sport? And a good case study is South Africa, because South Africa, like Brazil, is a country with rich and poor together, and rich in South Africa still mostly means white. And almost all South Africa's points, South Africa is the only African country that scored any points in our test, but almost all those points came from the white South Africans, who are less than 10% of the population. And whites are almost all the Springbok rugby team that won the World Cup in 1995 and 2007, all 5 South African golfers who've won major tournaments are white, almost all the country's best cricketers until recently white. And if we had treated white South Africa as a separate country, it would have been 3rd in the world for sporting success per capita. And that's because whites in South Africa had almost all the resources of the country under apartheid. They had schools with beautiful playing fields, they had the best medical care, coaches starting from primary school, and to some degree they still do. So white South Africans are good at sport. The South African football team, which is almost all non-white, is bad. And that's the case study in one country. Okay, so I've shown, I think, that rich countries are good at sport, but that leaves just one question. Why are so many of the best European footballers from poor ghettos? And it can't be, the cliche is, well, boys from the ghetto have this hunger to succeed, but if that were true, they would succeed in all sorts of fields, including law and medicine, not just in sport. So there must be something about their childhoods that makes them particularly well suited to football. And I think the reason is practice. People like Zidane or Ibrahimovic get much more chance than middle-class children to practice sport all the time. I mean, it goes back to the 10,000-hour rule, which, as you may know, was popularized by Malcolm Gladwell in his book Outliers. And it says that you need 10,000 hours to become excellent at anything, whether it's becoming a concert pianist or a neuroscientist or a footballer. Now, the 10,000-hour rule has been questioned by academics. There are a lot of holes one could pick in it. And it's probably not true in, for example, high jumping, where if you have the right physique, you can become a great high jumper very quickly. You don't need 10,000 hours. But football is a very skill-based sport, so the 10,000-hour rule or something like it probably is a good explainer of who becomes good at football. And if you think about how boys in poor ghettos grow up, they're almost forced into playing football all the time because they live in small apartments. They don't have many other leisure pursuits. They don't go on long holidays. On the whole, their parents are not making them stay in and do their homework. And so they go out onto the street where they meet a lot of other poor boys who live in the local apartment blocks who also want to play football. And so they spend those 10,000 hours playing. And that's why the best footballers tend to be from these very poor backgrounds, but typically living in rich countries like France or Sweden, which can then invest in them and channel them into becoming great footballers. And so it's wrong even to call people like Cristiano Ronaldo or Zinedine Zidane, as they were as children, poor, because by global standards, they were quite rich. You know, if you live in a ghetto in Marseille, you're much richer than most people in the world. I mean, a mark of Cristiano's family's poverty was that they had a washing machine. They had to keep the washing machine on the roof because there was no space for it in the apartment. But in a country like South Africa, having a washing machine would have marked the family out as wealthy. So, to sum up so far, money buys sporting success, and that's why Norway, for Soccernomics, is the real sporting world champion. Now, there's a second chapter in our book in which Norway also features heavily, and that's the chapter in which we ask, which is the most football-loving country in Europe? Only in Europe, because the stats aren't good for most of the rest of the world. Now, you might think loving football is a matter of the heart, which is hard to measure, but in fact, there are data, because loving football really breaks down into A, playing football, so which country plays a lot of football, B, going to the stadium to watch football, and C, watching football on TV. And we have stats for all three. Now, where would you think Norway would rank as a football-loving nation? I mean, Norwegians themselves think they don't rank very high. Here's a graph from a new French book by Bastien Dreux, Richard Duhautois, and it ranks Europeans who say of themselves that they're very interested in football. And this is self-reported, obviously. And if you speak French, you'll see that the countries where people are most likely to say they're very interested in football are the ones with very strong football leagues. Spain, England, Italy, and Germany are the top four. And those are countries where, you know, in the office, people will get very excited on a Monday morning talking about how Liverpool or Borussia Dortmund have got on. And Norway ranks kind of lower mid-table, just after France, with less than 20% of the population saying they're very interested in football. And it certainly seems that football is not your favorite national sport. I mean, Knut Helland, that Bergen University professor, told me that in surveys, Norwegians say they prefer biathlon and langlauf, which makes you, I think, unique in the world. So that was our presumption. Norwegians are not particularly football mad. But now let's see where the data take us. And first of all, playing. In 2006, FIFA, the blessed organization, did something called the Big Count, where they tried to count how many people in the world play football. And the Big Count is a very thick report, and there's a lot that one can say about it, and we do say things about it in Soccernomics. But I've just taken out one key page here, which is the countries with the most footballers according to these estimates. Not just registered, but people who say they play football as well, even if they're not in any official team. And so Norway does quite respectably. I mean, Costa Rica, I was in Costa Rica this summer. It's an amazing football country, because in every village, in the middle of the village, there's a beautiful grass football field, and everyone can play on it. And chickens graze on it. Kids go out and play. You see middle-aged women kicking a ball around, which I've not seen in any other country. And it's an amazing resource, which explains why such a small country is, you know, almost got to the semis of the last World Cup. Germany, we know about. And then a lot of islands like the Faroes or Vanuatu, where I guess there's not much else to do except play football. Small islands. And so Norway did pretty well there, as well as some other European countries. Now, next question, how many people in each European country regularly go to the stadium to watch professional football? And if you took a 2-week period in which every team in the top division played at home once, these are the countries where most people, as a percentage of the population, go to watch. And in the Faroes, it's amazing. But Norway also ranks pretty high. Even though these countries mostly have terrible football leagues, people are willing to sit in the stadium and watch. And then our last test was TV viewing. And we had stats for World Cups and European Championships, 1998 to 2008, of which countries had the highest average viewing of normal games, so games in which the country itself is not playing, so for example, and which are not the World Cup final or something. So how many Norwegians would watch an average World Cup game, like say Portugal-Ghana at the last World Cup? And here's our top 5 in the world of all the countries that they measured, which is not all countries. For example, African countries, there's no stats like these. But the top 5 in the world, Norway right up there. Now, this Norway's keenness to watch football on TV is partly because of its unusual TV market. As you'll know better than me, apparently commercial TV took a long time to get going in Norway, so there were fewer TV stations here than in other countries, and so often people didn't really have much choice except to watch football. There wasn't this 500-channel galaxy. But on the other hand, you know, this is not even your favorite TV sport and you're watching it. So we put these 3 things together: playing football, watching on TV, watching in the stadium, and the winner of Europe's most football-mad nation in Soccernomics, at least until our 2014 edition, is Norway. Congratulations. And I called this Norwegian sports historian I know, Matti Goksøyr, I'm sure I'm mispronouncing his name, and I said, why is Norway the most football-loving nation in Europe? And he was very surprised. And he said, Norway, a winter nation, impossible to play football in wintertime, it's really a mystery. So why Norway? I mean, there were early signs of dangerous obsession in the late 1940s when football betting was introduced here. And nowadays the whole world bets on football. But the Norwegian oddity was that back then, all the games on the betting form were from English football, even in the late 40s. And Goksøyr says, and that was self-evident, it had to be like that. Because, you know, as you know, Norwegians don't just watch Norwegian football. If we'd have put in a ranking for watching English football, you'd probably also be number 1. I mean, everyone in the world now watches English football, even though, as people point out, it's not the best football. But you got there first. So Saturday, November 29th, 1969, momentous day in Norwegian history. Decades before the Premier League hatches its secret plans for global domination, Norwegian TV broadcasts its first ever English football match. Wolves 1, Sunderland 0. And the nation is immediately hooked. And I'm told the Saturday game from England quickly became an institution, and nowadays even tiny English teams like Rushden and Diamonds have Norwegian fan clubs. King Harold is apparently an honorary member of the Spurs supporters club here. And then there are the plane loads of Norwegians who almost commute to Old Trafford. The British National Tourist Agency Visit Britain says that in 2011, 80,000 Norwegians came to see a football match in Britain, which is more than any visiting nationality except the Irish. And while doing this, you also find time to lead the world in winter sports. I have one piece of bad news to conclude. We ran this test again of most football-loving nation for the new edition of Soccernomics that we're now publishing in France. And it came up with a new winner of most football-mad nation in Europe. I'm sorry to say it's Iceland. Because the Icelanders, FIFA did this pretty good study of who watched the 2010 World Cup. And the Icelanders watched in just incredible numbers. It's almost like the whole country watched every game. And so now they're officially Europe's kookiest football nation. But of course, Iceland is also a cold social democracy and therefore has quite a lot in common with Norway and with the Faroes. So I want to end with my brief theory about why Norway ranks as so football mad. And I think it's because of gender equality. In countries that we think of as football mad, like Italy or Brazil or England, football's traditionally been a male-dominated domain. And although the audience here is almost entirely male, it's still a Norwegian peculiarity that women play almost as enthusiastically as men. The Norwegian FA started hunting for women players back in the 70s, which was, in most countries, football for women had just been unbanned then. It had been banned for a very long time. And today, about 1 in 23 Norwegian females is a registered footballer, which is the highest proportion in any country in the world. And in fact, last time I checked, Norway had more registered female players than England, despite having 1/10 of the population. So it's no coincidence that the world's most developed country, according to the United Nations, is also the one that gives the largest share of its inhabitants the opportunity to play and to watch football. So perhaps Norwegian men are only averagely football mad, or probably a bit more than averagely, but if you throw in the women as well, you become European champions. So, in other words, buy Soccernomics, because it will make you feel great about yourselves, but I've spent half an hour lecturing you about your country, and I'm sure you'll have quibbles, so I'd be very keen to hear your views. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Simon. Are there any questions, Simon? Come on.
Yeah, but I forgot.
Sorry?
Yeah, but I forgot.
Oh.
That's okay.
I read there was a Guardian article yesterday which ranked the top 50 under-18 players, most talented, and South Africa had one, and he was white. So even in 2015,
Yeah.
a 17-year-old is a white 17-year-old South African, which is,
Do you know his name?
I can't remember, but it was on the Guardian yesterday.
It's interesting, yeah, and I think the captain of the football team, the South African football team, is white. So even in football, the South African team is not black largely, because South Africa people still think of themselves as belonging to particular races as under apartheid, and the coloureds, as they're called in South Africa, who are slightly better off than the blacks, lived in slightly better neighbourhoods, slightly better fed. They've historically dominated the South African national team, so players like Sean Bartlett or Benny McCarthy counted as coloured.
So the same in other African countries as well, because the coach of Zambia and Ivory Coast, he's also a white Frenchman.
Yeah, those are foreigners, but it's been the tradition to import European football knowledge, which I actually think they should be doing. I think Brazil should also be doing that, because I think Western Europe is the most advanced country in terms of football thinking. So I think America was very smart to appoint a Western European coach. The African countries tend not to get the best coaches, but yeah, they do that.
How did Sweden and Denmark do compared to Norway?
Denmark didn't feature quite so highly. Yeah, a little bit more disappointing. Sweden does very well, although I don't think it ended up in our highest scoring nation. So yeah, you definitely beat them. Yeah. Sorry.
What do you think about the future of football in the United States? Would they come up to a Western European level?
Well, my wife is from Miami, so we go to Miami in summer, which is a crazy thing to do. And my children went to a Paris Saint-Germain football camp in Miami, because the big clubs, there's a Barcelona football camp in Miami, etc. And as many people have commented, the number of American kids playing soccer is just astounding, and how it's become part of the discourse. So I was in New York just before the 2010 World Cup, and there was more World Cup going on in bars and things than in Paris, where I live. So I think that they have the numbers, they have the money, which are key factors. What they lack slightly is the know-how. I mean, I grew up in Holland, which is a country which has always had, until now, the best football know-how. Positioning on the field, how you open space when you have the ball, close it when you don't. And when I moved to England, I realized that England, this other European country just across the sea, had this enormous lack of football know-how. English people don't know how to play football. So knowing how to play football is really, really important. So the Spaniards learned, having not known, and then the Germans, and what was very scary for Holland is about 15 years ago, when German football was at rock bottom, the Germans looked at Holland and at France and said, how do we play football? And when the Germans start to learn from other countries, that's very scary, because they're definitely going to do it better than you once they've worked it out, and they have more people. So essentially, I think what we saw at the last World Cup was the Germans learning from Holland, France, later Spain, and fixing it. So know-how, I think, is just the key propellant in football, more than population size. And the US still lags on that, but Klinsmann is bringing that know-how. So, I mean, they're already always around 10th in the world. You know, they tend to get to last 16, last 8. So I don't think they're very far away. So, sorry, do you want to choose the questioners? Because yeah.
Yeah, I'm a bit unsure if the World Cup is a very good indicator of like, the everyday football interest of people. How many people watch the Premier League or
It's true the World Cup is obviously a bit odd, but otherwise you can't compare, because then you'd have to look at how many Norwegians watch the Norwegian League and the Premier League versus how many Germans watch the German League and the Premier League. And Germans probably watch the Premier League less because they have their own league, which is good. So the only way, only a World Cup and a European Championship are kind of equalizers for Europeans at least, that it's the same product for everybody. So yeah, I mean, there's a lot that one could quibble with, and you could look at how many people watch football programs on TV each week, but then you get into all sorts of measurement comparisons that are difficult.
Yeah, the cover of your book said that Japan, the US, and Australia would do great in the future in soccer, and I was just wondering how's the future looking for Norway?
How Norway?
Yeah, how will we fare the next 20 years? Up or down?
I think down. I think Norway, like most European countries, is close to peaking because our region just dominates football. I mean, the last 3 World Cups, if you count the 3 podium places, first, second, and third, 8 out of the 9 were Western European countries. And all sorts of different countries, you know, from 2006 till 2014, you know, Portugal, Holland, Spain, Germany, they were all up there. And only Argentina won a podium place in the last 3 World Cups, not from Western Europe. And if you look at the last World Cup, we have 6% of the world's population, our region, and the other 94% of the world has one football team that can match us, which is Argentina. So it's just crazy, our level of dominance, and it has to diminish, and it will diminish by countries like the US and Japan looking at what we're doing and getting better at copying it. So, I mean, Norway is a little bit kind of behind in football know-how because you're across the sea from the best countries. You're more of a winter sports nation, so there's less sharing and learning in football than there is, say, between Holland and France and Spain and so on. But still, you have a lot of football know-how, and I think what's going to happen in the next 20 years is the rest of the world is going to catch up in football know-how. And for example, in Brazil, they must be having a conversation about, we know nothing about football, we have to learn. I would hope they're having that conversation. And once Brazil starts to learn how to play football, I mean, probably today Norway would beat Brazil, but in 10 years' time that has to be different.
Any idea why this free kick theory won't get any traction? You mentioned Cristiano Ronaldo, but he's been a terrible free kick striker for the last year.
Yeah, I mean, maybe even Cristiano shouldn't be allowed to take free kicks, but if he shouldn't, maybe Messi can, but we say to all the other players in the world, you're not allowed to take direct free kicks. And I think it's partly about status hierarchies in the team, because the best player is the guy who takes free kicks. And he's going to say, of course I should shoot it at goal because...
But what about the manager?
I think they're going to start to figure it out. I mean, I haven't seen how Midtjylland, which is this very data-driven team in Denmark, takes free kicks. But I read that they were scoring last year on average 1 goal from free kicks every match. So my guess is they're not shooting it from 30 yards into the top corner, but they're passing it into the penalty area. So I'd be very curious to see how they're doing it. But I think that is going to take off, and that the manager's going to say to players, anyone who shoots a direct free kick at goal. I mean, the thing is, you have to shoot 1 at goal, say 2 out of 10 at goal, just so the other team puts in a wall. Because what you want is the other team to have a wall so that they lose some players who would otherwise be marking you. So you have to shoot, say, 2 or 3 out of 10 at goal, and then the others you pass. And if I were a manager, I'd say anyone who breaks this rule, I will, fine or something. Sorry.
Yeah, you were talking or sharing about how the wealth and how good you are at football has a link. And I started wondering about, like, in the big sense, when you have, like, I saw Norway and Switzerland was very high up on that list. And both of these countries has a lot of mountains. And for me, it's like, maybe that has something to do about it. Just let me explain. It's like we have a lot of stuff that we have to overcome, like we have to walk up a lot of hills, we have to have like that stamina. And that's important in football as well. And it's important, I think, also for Norwegians especially, that we are kind of like not too social people. Like
Yeah, I certainly think that supporting a sports team is a way for men in particular to express emotions, because it's a place where you can stand in the stadium and sing, "We love you, David Beckham." I mean, men who would never say that they love their wives will sing about their love for David Beckham or for Manchester United. So I do think that sports is a place where it's okay to express emotions, and that may help, maybe. It certainly helps English people, maybe it helps Norwegians as well. But in terms of mountains, I mean, it certainly helps you for winter sports, having mountains. I mean, I grew up in Holland, and we don't have any, but so there are no Dutch skiers. But in terms of overcoming adversity through the landscape, I mean, Nigeria has a pretty adverse landscape, but they don't produce great sportsmen. So I think you need to have wealth as well. Yeah. Are we through with all questions? Sorry, no, this man.
It's sort of off topic, but in reference to the recent FIFPro complaints, or whatever you want to call it, have you got any views on the future of the transfer system in football?
I tend to think the transfer system is going to survive, just because it's been accepted as an institution for a very long time. And although it probably isn't good for football, as FIFPro says, the European Commission, if they have to make the decision, they would, I think, tend to be biased in favour of the status quo, which not many people have complained about. It'd be quite a radical thing to do, to abolish transfers. So I don't think the European Commission, if it's them, would be brave enough to do so. So that man at the back with the cap.
On the cover of Soccernomics, you write that Iraq will be a dominant force in football.
Yeah, it's perhaps a brave prediction, but what we showed is that Iraq is a massive overperformer in football. I mean, it's not a rich country. It's had a lot of problems, as we know, and it's just fantastic at football. They win most of their matches in Asia. They've won the Asian Cup a couple of times. They do way, way better than they should, given their population, their wealth, and their problems. And, for years they couldn't even play matches in Iraq. They probably can't play matches in Iraq now. So what we said is, and we wrote this at a slightly more hopeful time for Iraq, if Iraq ever becomes a normal country, then watch out, world. If Iraq were to be as peaceful as, say, Kazakhstan, then, their potential would be unlimited. But that is not the case, unfortunately, at the moment. Sorry, this man at the front had a question.
I feel like the whole world has been waiting for Africa to finally get off in the World Cup, and we've had countries like Ghana who have, impressed us in the World Cup. And people have been saying that once they figure out the know-how how to play football, like to learn basic tactical instructions and so forth, they would, maybe start dominating the football world. Do you think so?
No, I mean, this is one thing I got right in my first book, Football Against the Enemy, where, people have been saying since, I think, the 1950s, Africa will win a World Cup one day. And it gets less and less likely. So 1990, Cameroon were probably closest of any African team ever to winning a World Cup. They were a really good team. And since then, and I showed in Football Against the Enemy, African performances at World Cups have actually got worse, if you count points per match per team. And they're really terrible. And I think it's this lack of know-how has got worse, because in the last 25 years, we in Western Europe, we've integrated football around Europe with the transfer system. So you have multinational club teams, and you have the Champions League, where you have Manchester United playing Barcelona every Tuesday night. And so what you get is, we've got incredible learning in Europe. We're all learning very rapidly from each other. I mean, a country like Norway, less so, because you tend not to export many players to top teams, and you're usually not in the Champions League, so your best players are not learning in the same way as the best, say, French or Dutch players are. But with the rest of most of Europe, the best countries are exchanging knowledge. So when Spain is better than Germany, like in 2008 at the Euro, Germany sees exactly how Spain plays, learns from it, then they make study visits to Barcelona, and next thing you know, Germany is better than Spain. So the exchange of knowledge in Europe is incredible, and the Africans, but also the Asians and the Americans, they're all excluded from that. I mean, at least the US gets, a few of its best players here, although the US is now handicapped by the best players are increasingly staying in Major League Soccer because there's some money there now, and they'll never get good. You're never going to get good in soccer unless you come to Western Europe quite young, probably age 5, like Didier Drogba, which is why he was the best African player. He moved to France as a 5-year-old. I mean, he could have been playing for France. And if you're not in that exchange of know-how, you're never going to be good, and that's what we're seeing with Africa. Sorry.
Also regarding the African teams, aren't there also problems regarding the I don't know what you call it, the envy between the African stars doing well in European clubs coming back to the countries like in Ghana, in Nigeria, with you have like two and you have like other players who are having troubles in their own country, and the Ghana team now in the World Cup with there seems like strong or big personalities and players having clinches with the coaching staff or the managers. So there's like problems inside the team.
Yeah.
The players having experience in things in Europe. It doesn't seem like they are using that in a good way for the team.
I mean, I think what the main problem seems to be is that, as you say, a lot of the players are quite poor. And also, if you earn any money as an African footballer, you end up supporting a lot of people back home, which Samuel Eto'o could do, but a guy who's played maybe 3 seasons in the Israeli league can't do. So there's a lot of envy, as you say, but I think what then happens is the World Cup comes. You go to the World Cup with 22 players, and that's the money moment. There's a lot of, each country is paid a large sum by FIFA, which FIFA usually pays the country's football association, which in some African countries the FA president just puts it in his pockets, the players never see it, so they get very upset. And also the World Cup is your chance to get a foreign transfer. So you score a goal in the World Cup, and next thing you know, you're playing 3 seasons in Spain, you're earning 500,000 euros a season, and that's you for life. So there's an enormous amount of anxiety and then money troubles, and so what you see more and more is the money gets stolen by the FA president, and then there's all sorts of quarrels which disrupt the training camp. I mean, I think last World Cup it happened to Cameroon, Nigeria, and Ghana. Was Cameroon there? It happened to about 3 African teams, and of course it's disastrous for preparation. So yeah, I think that's another example where being a rich country is very helpful. Rich countries do well. So, no.
You have an explanation why the Premier League clubs do so bad in the Champions League despite all the money?
Well, my newspaper, the Financial Times, did a kind of data analysis. We now have a data editor, which is a new journalistic trend. And he showed that if you look at which teams rest their best players for Champions League, the English teams tend to rest their best players, and the more they rest their best players, the worse they do in the Champions League. So I think that the Premier League has become so financially significant and significant for status that the Champions League is a little bit of an afterthought. And so they, for a start, they give everything on Saturday, and then they rest a couple of good players. So I think that's part of the argument. Also, as I say, English people still don't know anything about football, and although as the English complain that only 1/3 of the players in the Premier League are English, but that's probably way too many. So that's another handicap. Sure.
Do you think some of the Albania, for example, they are experiencing some success right now? Bosnia has been pretty good recently, but some of the players are people who grew up in, for example, Switzerland, Untitled Chapter, and some others, and Veldig from Bosnia. This is an explanation why they are doing so well.
Yeah, I didn't know that about Albania, that they had foreign players, but that makes sense. I mean, the Bosnian team is very largely, I think it's a diaspora team almost entirely. And a lot of the African teams, like Algeria, which did very well at the last World Cup, so people said, oh, African football is rising, but that's not true, because the Algerian team was almost entirely guys who were born and raised in France. So yeah, I mean, that's another part of the Western Europe is best argument, that if you grow up in Western Europe, your chance of being a very good footballer is much higher than if you grow up in Croatia or Bosnia. So for example, Rakitic is Croat, but he grew up in Switzerland as well. So in fact, Switzerland would have an incredible team if they could just field the Swiss players. So yeah, I think it's, whether you're going to become a great footballer is almost fated by whether you are raised in Western Europe. Sorry, there was somebody...
Oh yeah, any views on the
The Platini story. And Platini was so dubious. He voted for Qatar after this lunch at the Elysee Palace, where Nicolas Sarkozy, the then president, and the Qatari prince said, well, you know, it'd be nice if you voted for Qatar, because then we'll buy Paris Saint-Germain, we'll set up a TV station to buy the rights to the French league, which will put a lot of money into French football. And of course, Qatar buys loads of French stuff anyway. You know, Qatar is a big importer of French products. So Platini voted for Qatar. Platini's son then became the CEO of a Qatari sports company. And I mean, I spoke to this UEFA official who I respect, and he said Platini's really straight. He's not corrupt. And I said, well, why does he do this crazy stuff? And this guy said, if you're Platini, you know, you're a great footballer. People have been giving you stuff your whole life. People have been kind of paying you homage and giving you presents your whole life. So you just think it's normal. You think this is the way it works. And of course, he's had no education in just basic business ethics. That, you know, Blatter seems to have given him a lot of money in 2011 to not run for president. And, you know, basic business ethics says you should be very careful of taking that money, because one day it's going to come out. Maybe one day Blatter will leak that fact, and then you're screwed. But he doesn't seem to have realized this. But I mean, today's suspensions are so weird and opaque. I mean, I'm sure Blatter and Platini deserve it. But why did they get 90 days and this Korean candidate gets 6 years? I don't understand at all. And this FIFA ethics committee that was Blatter's pet for many years, suddenly they've come out and they're suspending everyone without, you know, giving their reasons for the 90 days, 6 years. It's not justice either. What's happening today is also completely opaque and unjust. Even if those guys deserve punishment, this is not how it should be done.
Which country do you think will take over after Germany as the best?
Logically, it should be Germany, because they're the biggest country in Western Europe. They have a great football tradition, and they learn to learn from other people. So, I mean, Holland has collapsed out of the top. England will probably always be the story of great unfulfilled potential. I think if anyone is going to come back, likely France. You know, the bigger population than Spain, very well organized. Yeah, I would say France is probably the best contender. I think Germany could be there as well. Yeah. Sorry, you had a question.
Yeah, a bit relating to the FIFA part, but also to football in general. A keyword is transparency. So is it important to be transparent and not just exploiting others that are transparent about what they're doing in order to get good?
Sorry, it's important to be transparent and not...
Is it important to be transparent about what you're doing, football-wise, and not just exploiting others that are transparent in order to be good?
You mean to run your domestic football in a transparent way?
Yeah, I mean, Rosenborg, when they were good in Norway, or when they were like dominating, they said that anybody can come here, learn what we're doing. We want them to be better, because that makes us better as well. So I was just wondering if that's
I think
in general a good idea.
Yeah, I think inner country learning makes the country better. I mean, that team could be weakened. I mean, Rosenborg could be weakened by, you know, some other club. Like, it was always weird that a club in Trondheim was the best in the country. They shouldn't have the economic base for that to be possible. So you'd think that if a big club in Oslo learned from them, they would soon be better. So it's a risk for the club, but for the country's football, it's incredible. I mean, I see that in Holland, where Ajax was always the most intelligent football club, and Feyenoord were always beaten by them. And gradually Feyenoord started to work out, what do Ajax do? How do they scout players? How do they coach players? Feyenoord started doing it, and now the best players in Holland come from Feyenoord. So yeah, that kind of inner country learning is very productive, and it's very easy because you can go and visit all the time. You speak the same language. So yeah, I mean, that's the way to improve as well, intra-country learning.
How do you take on the success of Wales and Iceland?
It's really bizarre. I mean, And Northern Ireland, yeah. I mean, it's not just because of the expansion to 24 teams, because Iceland are going to win the group, I think, and Wales are top of the group, so it's got to do with that. I guess best practice is spreading very quickly in Western Europe, that even small countries are working out quickly how to put up a defense, but even more ambitiously how to create an attack. So yeah, I mean, I think our Western European learning is fantastic. And then, you know, a bit of luck of having Gareth Bale apparently has carried Wales through a lot of the qualifying group, so a bit of luck like that helps. So, there was somebody else back there. Sorry. No, I can't see. Sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah, I've got two different. I'll be quick. Everyone's talking about Qatar, but 4 years before that, the World Cup is in Russia. Do you think everything has been said and done about Russia getting the World Cup? And do you think that with everything what's going on, do you think we can get like a East European boycott of the Olympic Games in Los Angeles and the Moscow Games before that in 2018?
I don't think anyone's going to boycott the World Cup, and I'm 99% sure that the next two World Cups will be in Russia and Qatar, just because Russia and Qatar are very powerful countries in geopolitics. You don't want to mess with them, and you don't want to mess with them about something as unimportant as football, because if you take away from Putin what for him is an event of enormous prestige, he will mess you up over Syria or Ukraine or something, and nobody wants that. So, and then Qatar will get out all their lawyers and sue you, and they'll also show that all the other countries bidding also did corrupt things, to say the least. So I don't think that this is going to be reversed, no. The decision might be made differently for the next World Cups, maybe.
Do we have a last question?
I have a lot of questions.
Yeah.
Can you say anything about how fast the quality of football is improving? For example, how good would the French 98 team stand up today if they somehow choose to join the World Cup as they were in 98?
I mean, suddenly the physical demands are much, much higher. I also think that defending is much better than it was. And I was watching a video of the European Championship 1988, which Holland won. And when the video comes on, you just want to laugh, because the players were so thin. They seem to have almost no muscle at all. And then you look at someone like today, like Cristiano or Benzema, and it's like he's from another species. But I don't think it's just the physical. I think that positioning has improved. I think, not sure about skill, but of course you need more skill to do the same things at high pace with better defending. So I wouldn't know how to quantify that, but I'm sure that that French team of 98 would not win the World Cup now, no.
Well, I want to, on behalf of the Bergen Public Library and the University Library, thank you for a delightful.
Thanks very much. Thank you.
And thank you all.
Thank you, everyone.